welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe if you are new. The World Boxing Super Series Super Middleweight Final looks set to be contested by George Groves and Callum Smith. Now there is some doubt about the participation in the final of George Groves after he sustained an injury in his semi-final victory over Chris Eubank Jr. My belief is that where the tournament is at, it is essential for the success of the final that George Groves is involved. Let us not forget, the World Boxing Super Series organisers are very incentivised to sell tickets, they're very incentivised to sell pay-per-views, and they're very, very incentivised to have this be something that really attracts the attention of the fans. As such, I believe it is highly unlikely that they will progress to the finals without involving George Groves. I believe, given the success he has had in the tournament, he will be integral to making the final what it needs to be. I do not believe that the final will progress unless George Groves is healed and ready to go, even if it involves a delay. So from my standpoint, I believe it is highly likely that the final will be contested between Callum Smith and George Groves, whether or not that leads to delays. With that in mind, potentially it's worth this as a very, very early thoughts, initial look at who I think is going to win this fight. Now, detractors of Callum Smith will say that Callum Smith has had a relatively easy ride to the final. And do you know what? I'm just going to be factual. In my opinion, he has had an easy ride to the final. Smith beat Eric Skoglund in round one. Skoglund performed with credit, caused Smith quite a lot of problems. Probably took 4 rounds off Callum Smith, I would say. And I guess in hindsight, it's easy to look back and say Skoglund is a sort of mid-level European type fighter. Smith was due to face Jürgen Bremer in the semi-finals. Many, including myself, believed that would be the sternest test of Smith's career to date. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and Smith had to fight Niki Holzgen, who was better known as a kickboxer than a boxer. And Smith won, the majority of rounds in that fight. You could make an argument, therefore, that Callum Smith is getting to this grand stage, the final of the World Boxing Super Series, without really being tested. And if you reflect at Callum Smith's entire boxing career, and you had to pick out his 3 best wins, who would you say? Would you say Rocky Fielding? Would you say Eric Skoglund? Would you say Christopher Brasse? None of those guys you could really make a case for being top 10, top 15 fighters in the division with which they operate. So you could make a case Callum Smith has had a relatively easy ride to the finals. I have heard people, and I disagree with this, but I'm just playing devil's advocate. I have heard people speculate that George Groves has had an easier than anticipated route to the final. Groves has beaten Jamie Cox and Chris Eubank Jr. 2 guys who were somewhat untested. 2 guys who had big boxing disadvantages to George Groves, and fundamentally 2 guys who are now being written off as blown up middleweights who should never have been campaigning at super middleweight to begin with. The same detractors state that when George Groves has had the elite fights in his career, the Froches, the Badu Jacks, he's come up short. Where I am, I think Groves dealt very well with handy fighters in in Cox and in Eubank, and I also think he has prior form on his resume with the likes of Chudanov, with the likes of James DeGale, if you want to go back into the annals of history, that make us think that George Groves is a very, very formidable fighter and deserves his position where he's at. Regardless, the 2 guys are going to square off, and it's an interesting competition. In brief, looking at the case for both guys, if one was to make a case for Callum Smith, we could say that George Groves has spent his career enjoying a size advantage over most fighters. He was a substantially bigger man against Eubank, a substantially bigger man against Cox, a substantially bigger man against Chudanov. That's his last 3 fights. Groves has enjoyed that big size, height and reach advantage, which has really complemented his boxer-jabber style. Now he's going to be going up against a guy in Callum Smith, who's even bigger than him, and potentially substantially bigger than him. Could that be a real issue for George Groves? Could we say Vladimir Klitschko went through his entire career being the big man, and when he fought a guy who was bigger than him, and I appreciate Klitschko had fought other big guys like Mariusz Wach, but when he fought the guy who was bigger than him, who actually had skills at a certain level in Tyson Fury, he came up short. People are already starting to make that case again about Callum Smith. How will George Groves cope being the smaller man? Callum Smith, his best weapon is probably his body punching, those hooks to the body that he lands very well, quite accurately, quite snappily. George Groves a fighter who, at certain points in his career, has shown a tendency to tire, a tendency to fall apart late in fights. Now, against Eubank Jr., he certainly didn't fall apart late in fights, but I think definitely we can say that Groves was more dominant in the first half of the fight than the second half of the fight, and Groves probably had his least dominant period in the last 2 or 3 rounds. So people are making that argument that if Callum Smith can start banking those bits of bodywork from round 1, by the time they get to the second half of the fight, with Smith's size advantage and with his bodywork, he could have Groves in a very, very difficult position. As for George Groves, I think Callum Smith has shown at times in his career that he's susceptible to a jabber. He's susceptible to people who jab with him. The Eric Skoglund fight was a classic example of that. When Skoglund got his jab going against Callum Smith, Callum Smith struggled for periods in that fight, and he's going up against a guy in George Groves who has a very, very good jab. Smith has a long, robotic jab. George Groves, looking at him, you kind of get the impression that he can do a bit more with it. He can approach it from different angles. He can catch you with it in a more unexpected fashion. You also suspect that George Groves is a slightly smoother, more explosive fighter than Callum Smith. There are times Smith has a little bit of a tendency to be a little bit static, a bit more rigid, sometimes looks very tall, very straight up, limited upper body movement, limited head movement, whereas Groves, you can look at him and make the case that he's the fighter who does a little bit more in there, a bit more explosive, gets you from different angles, gets you with more unexpected punches, has a little bit more variety, etc, etc. So I think it's a fight where you can make cases for both guys. Nevertheless, George Groves is going to start this fight as a real favourite. And rightly so. Groves goes into this fight as a world champion. Callum Smith has never quite operated at that level. Groves goes into this fight with many, many, many more big fights behind him, which Callum Smith hasn't had. Groves has had better victories than fights Callum Smith has had. And, the benefit of that experience, the benefit of that proven form at the top level really does mean that George Groves enters this fight as a considerable favourite. In terms of styles, whilst I think you can make a case that Callum Smith is the bigger guy and Callum Smith has better bodywork, I believe at this early stage that style-wise, the fight breaks down quite nicely for George Groves. I think that Groves, despite being a smaller man, has vast potential in this fight to really out-jab Callum Smith. And for me, when Callum Smith is getting out-jabbed, there kind of isn't really a plan B. That Skoglund fight, for me, it was worrying how readily Skoglund was landing with that jab on Callum Smith. And it was a bit of a concern how there wasn't an instant adjustment from Callum Smith. He was getting caught with that jab, and then the same thing happened around after. And then the same thing happened around after. And then he looked kind of bloody for a few rounds. He got a hurt nose, injured nose, and then he looked slightly more ragged than we've been expecting. I think Groves has the potential here to use his long-range game, to use that jab, and to really start to pepper Callum Smith with it, and to, take that element of his game away from him. When the going gets tough, and I'm sure at points in this fight the going will get tough, you've got to ask yourself about fundamentals. Who can have a plan B? And I believe that Groves' movement, Groves' punch variety and arsenal, and Groves' experience give me the greater confidence that if either fighter needs to find a plan B, Groves is the kind of guy who's going to do that. This is a big step up for Callum Smith. We're not sure if Callum Smith has ever been in with someone who can punch as hard as George Groves. We're not sure that Callum Smith has ever been in there with someone who can box as well as George Groves, or has a jab as well as George Groves. And I think there are a lot of doubts. Callum Smith has come through every test he's faced in his career to date, but some of them have been slightly less convincing. And the way he's dealt with opposition like Christopher Brass, Nicky Holzken, Eric Skoglund, he's kind of looked like he's a level above those guys, but only one level above those guys. He hasn't cruised through those tests with the ease that you would have hoped and you would have expected. Now, there are mitigating circumstances. You know, the Holzcombe fight was at very short notice, for example. Smith hadn't had time to prepare, and actually he'd been preparing for a very different fighter. The Rabras fight, you know, Smith struggled with Rabras at times, so did George Groves when Groves fought. So I'm not by any means wanting to pick holes in Callum Smith and say that this is going to be easy work for George Groves. But if I had to stick my colour to a mask right now, who would I be going for? I'd be going for George Groves. I think Groves really has the potential to out-jab Callum Smith, take that away from him. I think Callum Smith's propensity to stand up tall with no head movement, no upper body movement may mean that he's an easy target for Groves to find a home for his work. And when I look at the two, I'm seeing Groves as the one who is, you know, got the higher likelihood of succeeding. That's just my early take. We'll probably break down the fight in a lot more detail, talk a lot more about, you know, what's going to happen in the ring as we get to videos closer to the time. But that's my early thoughts on this. I'm interested to hear from people. Let me know your comments in the section below. You know, there does seem to be there's a section of people, a minority, but a vocal minority, who think Callum Smith will win this fight. So I'd be interested to get your take on that. You know, I'd like to hear what people think Callum Smith will do, and you know, how people think Callum Smith will be able to bring out the weaknesses of George Groves and raise his game to another level. So leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. If you're new or haven't already done so, please press subscribe.